Okay, talking about the recasting metal paper that you wrote about Meshuggah in 2008, and that you published in, I think it was Music Theory Spectrum,
Yes.
the journal. So
Yeah.
that was a turning point, at least for the music theory scholars that focus on metal that I have had the chance to talk to up till now, because they all quote your paper. So it was a seminal paper in some ways, and it seems that the difference there was that you used classical music theory tools. I mean, not classical, but you used academical music theory tools to analyze a phenomenon that was more considered pop music theory. So can you tell me a little bit about how you had the idea of studying Meshuggah this way? And yeah.
Yeah, in that paper, really what I'm looking at is, I look at two things specifically. And the first thing I look at is I describe how a lot of their riffs and grooves unfold, and the idea of metric superimposition, and there are a lot of different ways to describe it. But it was kind of like, here's what's going on in a lot of the riffs and grooves. And that's an interesting part, but I don't think that that's all that sort of phenomenal, so to speak. I think what was really interesting is that around that time, or it had been early 2000s, I think it was 2003 that they released I. And there are sections of that track that are just like sort of, I was like, they're doing the same thing, but they're doing it quite differently. Kind of the same idea of symmetrical hypermeter as guiding sort of large blocks of music. But this isn't sort of very simply explained. And I think that was, to me, the really interesting part about that article. So my goal was really to kind of unpack I and certain sections of I, where I thought that it was kind of unique insofar as they weren't doing, their large scale symmetrical structure stuff that guided it was the same as they had always used. But what was happening on the inside was very different. I'm a bass player. I'm an old bass player, I always have that performer perspective going in. And I thought to myself, well, there's no way you can perform this live, right? You can't keep all this stuff together, because if you get off, well, it's all over, right? Because nothing comes back for another 45 seconds, or we don't switch things. Whereas if you get off in some of the other riffs that I, was playing, the other Meshuggah riffs, I was like, well, actually, you can get yourself back on pretty easily. Like, even if you get really off, you just wait for the thing to cycle back for 4 bars of 4/4, and you're able to get yourself back on. Whereas with I, there were big stretches in there. I was like, if you get off, it's really over. And I think you actually see that, because I'm not aware that they've ever performed even sections of it live. And I was also very interested in then understanding how that stuff was put together. And so how do you perform it? How do you record it? I've always been very interested in how what I'm doing from a musical theoretical perspective can inform composition, performance. How can we use this? I'm very interested in kind of understanding that. And I'm not at all saying, and I think one of the things I should definitely clarify is that I'm not at all saying that this is compositional intent. Those two are very different things. I'm suggesting how I understand it, how I believe it's put together. I'm not saying that the Meshuggah guys thought about it this way. Ever since I published that article, they've always been saying, no, we're just in 4/4 and blah, blah, blah. And this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And, I met Thomas and Fred, and it's just like, they look at the diagrams that I have and they're like, yeah, whatever. But it's, they're always like, it's 4/4. And I'm like, yeah, it's a pretty interesting 4/4. And when you do this, when you play an I, like, it's really, really cool. And I found that the application of certain ways of thinking of kind of understanding pitch and rhythm within classical music were really easily sort of fit in to this. And particularly the idea of sort of like numeric strings, where you would put like a 2 would represent a quarter note, a 1 would represent an eighth note, a 3 would represent a dotted quarter note. And you attach those to certain pitches, and then you have these strings that sort of line up, as it could be 2, 2, 1, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, something like that. And it's like, all of a sudden I can see patterns that emerge within that, and it's way easy for me to play, instead of actually dealing it from like a notated musical perspective, which, most of these musicians aren't dealing with it from. So it was kind of like that idea. And I felt that I could bring in that way of analyzing to kind of create these maps that showed how, a couple minutes of music unfolded in ways that were derivative from what they were doing before, in terms of the large scale ordering and having sort of symmetrical hypermeter, their quote unquote 4/4. But you could also see how this was much more interesting going on than just saying, well, here's a riff that instead of being in 4/4, we're just going to either chop it off a little bit or elongate it a little bit and make sure that we all line up in the same place. sort of a 4/4 idea of what happens in a lot of minimalist music, where you just start a pattern that's in 5, or then you start a pattern that's in 3, and they'll eventually line themselves up, right? After a certain number. Well, you just do that within the framework of 4/4 hypermeter, and that's really kind of the gist of what it is that they do. Yeah. But in I, it's on a much bigger level, and you don't get the articulation of those small, repeated smaller groupings.
Yeah, I mean, for me, reading that paper, maybe the thing that struck me the most and that I thought was the most interesting is the concept that you use from Yeston, the concept of attack point interval. Mm-hmm. And it seems that in your research, like, for example, you mentioned your doctorate thesis, and that was kind of from what I understand, a meta music theory thesis, in the sense that you looked at different way of doing music theory, so Neo-Riemannian, Schenkerian, and Schoenbergian, and you kind of compared and contrast how the descriptive power of each other, the relative advantages and disadvantages. And so it was really interesting for me that you would use, attack point, what you call architectonal rhythmic analysis, and different ways of representing the music, because as you said, the guys from Meshuggah claim it's 4/4. Thomas Hocke, he said in an interview, it's all random. Nobody knows how I goes. And actually, and which is quite a feat in my opinion, which I thought was super interesting, you have managed to draw parallels so you show that in a way there is order that can emerge from it, because it's not totally random. You can see patterns re-emerging and being truncated and turned and reused in different ways. And something that you pointed out in your paper is that the polymetric metric superimposition approach kind of blinds us from seeing the fact that, for example, if you take rational gaze, the cells from rational gaze are derived from one another. They are derivative from one another. And it's true that it's something that you don't really see at all.
Right.
Yeah. So I thought that was very interesting.
Well, thanks. I also found there was a guy I want to mention. The guy's name was Nick Wolf. And I believe Nick was writing an undergraduate thesis somewhere in the UK. And I've tried to reach out to him. And he was doing some work on Dillinger Escape Plan. And I think he was looking at like 43% burned or something. I don't know what song he was looking at exactly. But he was like, I'm trying to make sense of this type of thing. And he sent me a transcription. I'll never forget this. Like, he sent me a transcription that he had worked up of that, and it was just spot on, and I was totally blown away. I was totally humbled by his transcription chops. This was amazing. But what was really fascinating is that he was trying to look at it through notated music. And I said, you have to kind of think in a performer way, right? Because I've seen Dillinger play a lot. And I was like, well, how do they keep this all together, right? Because it does feel very random, right? When Thomas says, oh, it's random, nobody knows, all this type of stuff, well, you're keeping it together somehow. And if you go see Dillinger, or when they were together, when you saw Dillinger perform, they were such dynamic performers, but they were a tight band. Like, this just wasn't, just noise. It was really sophisticated stuff they were playing. So I kept thinking, well, how do they put it together? And I suggested to him the idea that at times they're kind of working with those attack point intervals, or the idea of numbers, some way of figuring out in a numeric string that keeps everything together, right? So whether that be like a 3-3-2, 3-3-1-3, something like that, but something I can keep together as a performer. And that helps me through. And we started fiddling around with that song in that way. And you started seeing exactly in a different way, but you started seeing the same types of things. You started seeing patterns emerge, the same types of things you saw in Meshuggah. But it suggested to me kind of the utility of that approach. And also one that I think is derived from how the artists themselves are perhaps thinking about it. Again, I want to separate myself from saying this is how they're doing it, and I found the secret. This tends to be a really, everybody loves doing that. I unlocked the key of this complicated thing, and I'm not at all saying that. Just saying that it makes a lot of sense to use that way, because it's how I would approach it if I were, if I joined a Dillinger cover band. That's what I would do, right? Yeah. That's how I make sense of it.
Of course, but this concern with perspective, it seems to me to make total sense. I don't know if you're aware of J.Pieslak paper about Meshuggah, but in it he describes a part of it's on catch 33. Mm-hmm. And I think he uses a finger diagram, so he shows you that this bunch of notes that don't seem to make sense is just the musicians playing with the same finger pattern and just moving it in different ways, which is brilliant. It's really so. Yeah, that's a good example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's really important, particularly for players, when you think about some of this progressive stuff, to understand the performative side of it, to understand how the music originates. The guitar is about shapes, right? It's like when I teach my students, and we talk about like compositional instruments, and I deal with pianists, and then I show them a guitar, and I'm like, this is how you play a major scale on a guitar or bass. And they're like, that's it? I just learned one fingering pattern? and like the look in their eye is just like, oh my God, like this is so different from piano. We got to learn all the different fingerings, just to get through the major scales. So you're right. Like that's such a great point that he makes in that article, which is look at the shapes, look at how the functional elements of performing the instrument impact the composition. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that sometimes we lose a bit in our analytical perspective because we're so focused on the notes that we don't focus on elements of performance and sort of the compositional basis of a lot of the instruments.
Yeah. So yeah, by the way, I just remembered that's in Death is Death. I think that's the second part of it that I just mentioned. By the way, about Meshuggah, and maybe last question about Meshuggah. Do you feel like there has been, how do you feel about the evolution of Meshuggah? Because I also thought that the time when you wrote your paper is a very interesting time, because at the time you were aware of Catch 33 and and at that point it looked like Meshuggah had been getting crazier and crazier over the years, and nobody knew where they were headed. But with Obzen in 2008, and then that was confirmed by the later albums, they kind of, I don't want to say it's more simple, but it's like they stopped going, they got out of that lane of getting more and more progressive and conceptual. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I wonder, how do you feel about Meshuggah in 2020?
Well, I love them. I feel like, I don't think they've lost any credibility. I actually have to give those guys a lot of credit. Like they've stuck to it, right? And I think that sometimes we can be a little bit like, I think it's interesting to me. If not that we say that you create a brand and you stick to it, but that's kind of what tends to happen to a lot of people. I mean, you do have artists that sort of reimagine themselves and are able to do that. But by and large, like most of the time, people kind of find a groove and they stick with it, right? If I go to a concert and I go to a classical musical concert and there's a Philip Glass piece on there, I kind of know what I'm going to get because Philip's more or less been doing the same thing for a long time, right? I go, John Adams is on there, Michael Dougherty's on there, anybody, right? Chris Rouse. I kind of know what I'm going to get, right? Mm-hmm. And in a way, like they've been more or less doing the same thing. They haven't really kind of like redefined themselves. And I think like it was really just the band pulling together that synergy and finding their voice, and they found it. And that was and you risk a lot if you start, or I think that it can also be a lot of pressure to try to just sort of stay in a way like cutting edge. You can, going back a long time, like look at Radiohead, right? Like they had their thing, right? And I could always tell that it was Radiohead. And they kind of like, I guess like I don't want to say that these are bands that find a voice and then they don't evolve at all, but I guess long story short, I'm pretty happy with where they are right now. I love their stuff, and they found a thing. I really appreciate the fact that they interestingly seem to have within the metal subculture still retained a great deal of authentic or currency of authenticity, we might call it, right? Even though, right, with Obs, and that was kind of their move into whatever we might call the mainstream, right? And there really are the fathers of gent, right? And everybody goes back. And some of those gent bands, Periphery, some of these other gent bands are really popular. They sell a lot of albums. And you kind of have to say, like, in terms of sort of mainstream metal scene, it really shifted. You say, like, all right, early 2000s, you kind of had the new metal, whatever that was. You say, like, bands like Korn, and it sort of shifted to more of the gent popular bands, and they really have their founding fathers in Meshuggah, but they don't seem to have lost any of that credibility within the metal subculture that you might see kind of lose. Think about Metallica, right? And it was like, well, they were great up until, like, you have people who love them up to the Black Album, and then people who, are like, well, that's, Enter Sandman killed them, right? Or everybody who's like, that was the start of Metallica for them.
Yeah, of course.
So they seem to have weathered that storm pretty well.
I mean, in the case of Meshuggah, I didn't mean to say that they stopped innovating, but it's very interesting how they kind of changed lanes, and now for example, the last album was recorded in a studio and was not just like overdubbed like they did all the previous albums. Yeah. And of course, like Dr. Olivia Lucas, for example, I know does a lot of research on how they now use lights and on all these systems. So yeah, they keep on innovating in a different direction. It's very interesting, as you said, that it's true that in the meantime, since you've written this article, they have fathered a new subgenre, gent has been, and probably now is going down a little bit. So yeah, it's very interesting to see that.
Footnote 7, Recasting Metal. So you have the link to the paper in the description if you'd like to read it for yourself. And I also want to correct what I said during the conversation. The paper was published in 2007 and not 2008. Footnote number 8, Meshuggah's EP, I. Meshuggah's one-track EP, I, was released in 2004, and something else that J.Pieslak pointed out in his paper and that I thought was interesting was that the pitch bend at 3 minutes 33 was not there merely to serve as a transition between two parts of the song, but that its duration was also exactly closing the hypermeasure and thus preserving the hypermetric structure. It's also the only occurrence, as far as I know, of such a pitch bend in the music of Meshuggah, which goes to show that this song is really something that they never planned to play live, and that it's more of a studio experiment. I think that generally, a lot of Meshuggah's uniqueness comes from their creative process, which consists in writing and programming riffs in isolation rather than jamming them out like earlier bands had to. Their songs tend to be more composed and less improvised, which leads to a more intricately connected result. I also think that this is a defining characteristic of Dream Theater's writing process and of a lot of modern metal that both Meshuggah and DT influenced.